Fellas, this year in the UFC, we've had fighters who have gone out of their way to save the card or to save the UFC, and then we've had fighters who have completely done the opposite. So we're going to be going through a few examples of fighters who are saving / ruining the UFC in 2024. We're going to be going through both categories, fighters who would tend to be saving and going out of their way for the UFC, and then fighters who tend to be doing the opposite. And we'll start off with the fighters who, in my opinion, saved 2024 in the UFC, went out of their way to make it a better, just making the UFC better for the fans. And the first fighter I've got on this list is Tom Aspinall. I think that Tom Aspinall has gone out of his way, and I just think he has saved not only the UFC, but specifically the heavyweight division in 2024, despite beating like 5 top 10 or top 15 ranked heavyweights already. I feel like Tom Aspinall is kind of the only reason why the heavyweight division is still talked about nowadays. I think most people kind of consider him as the actual undisputed champion over Jon Jones, considering that Jones don't want any part of him, and we'll talk about Jones later on in this video. But I feel like Aspinall has just kind of saved the UFC, and MB fighting and saving UFC 304 by fighting in the core main event. That card wasn't even that good, but Aspinall's fight obviously stood out because it was in between two, well, it was just before the Leon fight, which was terrible, and he fought Curtis Blades, which he didn't have to. Curtis Blades, in my opinion, is the stylistically most difficult fight for Tom Aspinall in the entirety of the heavyweight division. A guy that has beaten him before, I know it was an injury, but he still has that win over him, and just a really difficult matchup for Tom Aspinall coming off that win over Jolton Almeida, and he goes out there and knocks him out in the first round and saves UFC 304. And it's not only just that from Tom Aspinall, it's not like he's gone out there, it's also the fact that he defended the interim belt. He was the interim champion. He didn't just sit around and wait for a title fight like he could have done. He defended his interim belt just to save UFC 304, and he's already said multiple times if Jones or Stipe pull out, he's ready to step back in. Not that that's going to do anything, because there's no way that Jones is fighting him regardless, but he said he'll be the backup for that fight. He's called them both out before. He even said the winner of Gon and Volkov, he'll happily fight the winner of that rematch. Volkov will fight Cyril Gon for the undisputed belt, assuming that Jones and Stipe retire. And just look at the state of the heavyweight division. Like I said before, if Tom Aspinall wasn't in the heavyweight division, this division would be an absolute mess, because there's no way that the most exciting fight you can put together in this division is Jones and Stipe. So I'm going to say that Tom Aspinall has saved 2024, mainly saved the heavyweight division. The fact that he's having these exciting performances, he's fighting consistently multiple times a year. Well, I know he's only fought technically once this year, but that's not necessarily his fault, because he wants to fight Jones and Stipe, and he wants to fight Cyril Gon and Volkov, but there's not really much he has in his power to do right now. But usually he's fighting twice a year. So for Tom Aspinall, I think he saved the UFC in 2024. The fact that he is ready to fight. He's ready to fight Jon Jones, but he's just not ready to fight. So I'm going to say that Tom Aspinall's one of them. The next fighter I've got is Max Holloway. Again, I think Max Holloway has kind of been saving the UFC in 2024. I mean, he comes into the UFC in 2024 on a 2-fight winning streak, and he could have done a lot from that. He could have just sit around and wait for a title shot, but instead he fights Justin Gaethje at UFC 300. Now, not only was this an amazing fight to add to UFC 300, but he didn't have to take this fight. In fact, I remember when this fight first got announced, everyone, including myself, was saying how this is such a dangerous fight for Max Holloway, how Justin Gaethje's coming off these insane wins. Why is Holloway moving up a division? Gaethje's going to be the guy to crack the chin of Max Holloway. This is done for Max Holloway. But not only did he absolutely piece up Justin Gaethje for the entirety of the fight and make them look skill levels apart in Justin Gaethje's weight class when Gaethje was on a winning streak, he then gets one of the greatest knockouts in UFC history right at the end when he didn't have to. He was the one that initiated him to scrap in the middle. He got the knockout, got one of the greatest knockouts, and now he's taking on Ilia Topuria for the featherweight belt, which in my opinion, I've said this multiple times, is the best fight that's currently been announced by the UFC. And he's fighting the guy that's undefeated, the featherweight champion, the guy who's well-rounded, the guy who beat Volkanovski, the same guy that beat Holloway 3 times. That's the guy that Holloway is fighting for the belt. So I feel like Max Holloway is another one of these fighters that we kind of have to praise for saving the UFC in 2024. He's been in some major fights, obviously against Justin Gaethje and now against Ilia Topuria, and I feel like both of the Holloway fights, I mean, you don't even have to wait for Holloway versus Topuria to see that it's going to be a banger. So I'm going to give Holloway his credit and say that he's another one of these fighters that he's kind of saving the UFC in 2024. And I think one of the major ones on this list, Alex Pereira. I mean, I don't think I really need to explain why Alex Pereira saved the UFC in 2024. Not just 2024, but his entire UFC career. Comes into 2024 after that knockout win over Yuri Prohaska, obviously at UFC 295 in November of last year, and immediately gets booked to save UFC 300 when he faces Jamal Hill. I made a video early this year about how UFC 300 was struggling for main events, and Alex Pereira goes up, turns up to UFC 300, saves the main event by fighting Jamal Hill. The build up to this fight was amazing as well. I'm not saying that Alex Pereira was on his A game when it came to trash talking, but I feel like the build up to this fight was amazing, at least from Jamal Hill. And then he goes out there and knocks out Jamal Hill in the very first round, and an iconic knockout, the way that he set the shot up perfectly, knocks out Jamal Hill, puts him to sleep, shuts him up once and for all. Or actually, to be fair, he didn't, because Jamal Hill's still talking, but he got the knockout. And then obviously, McGregor and Chandler was supposed to be for the main event of UFC 303, this massive pay-per-view that was quite a weak card because of how big the main event it was, and he stepped in on short notice to rematch Prochazka, a guy that some people thought was beating him the first time around, and it was an early stoppage. He rematches Prochazka on short notice and does the exact same thing, knocks him out. Well, he pretty much knocked him out twice in the same fight, because if that first round would have had an extra 10 seconds, he would have got the finish there, and then he knocks him out in the second round, and now he's booked against Khalil Roundtree a third time this year. When Pereira said he was taking a break, I was expecting him to come back next year, not just back in October after fighting in July, but he's back again for UFC 307 in the next pay-per-view against Khalil Roundtree. And I think people are kind of underrating Khalil Roundtree. Obviously, I think the smart move is to pick Pereira to win this fight, but Roundtree's not an easy guy to beat. The guy's got some great Muay Thai. So I think Alex Pereira definitely deserves his credit. He's saved multiple cards. He stepped in on short notice, and he doesn't have to do that considering that he is one of the most popular fighters in the UFC. He's one of the most well-known champions. He can call the shots, but instead, whenever the UFC need a fighter, they'll just call Pereira up and he'll come and save a card. So I think Pereira definitely deserves his recognition. And I'm also going to go with Drakkar Klose. I feel like Drakkar Klose was very disrespected at the beginning of the year as well, but I feel like he's kind of saved the UFC. Well, not saved the UFC, but kind of helped with the middleweight division specifically. Obviously, he fought Drakkar Klose at the beginning of this year, in January this year. And first of all, the press conference, the way that he built that fight with Sean Strickland, and if anything, won the press conference. I know you can't really win press conferences, but had the better of Strickland in that press conference with how angry he made Sean Strickland. So he had a great build-up, made one of the best press conferences this year, and then goes out there and puts on an absolute war against Sean Strickland, and then becomes the middleweight champion. You can say what you want about the decision, but he still went out there and did it. He still put on a great fight against Strickland, which a lot of people forget because of the decision, and he won the belt. And then he gets booked against Adesanya, one of the biggest rivalries in the middleweight division at the time, and does the same thing to Adesanya, makes him cry at the press conference. The guy with all the one-liners in Adesanya ends up crying from Drakkar Klose, and he finishes Adesanya. He does what we all wanted to see, what we wanted to see people do to Adesanya. Goes out there, humbles him once again, gets the rear naked choke, submits Israel Adesanya, and again, I feel like he's similar to Aspel on the heavyweight division. He's kind of saved the middleweight division from that boredom that Adesanya was giving us. Adesanya, during his title reign, it was almost as if most of the fights, like a good 75% of the fights, ended up being these boring decisions. So far, Drakkar's title reign has been more entertaining than most of Adesanya's fights. I mean, even just the Strickland fight and the Adesanya fight alone were really good fights, and the build-up to that with the fights with guys like Whittaker as well. So I feel like Drakkar Klose has done a really good job at generating a lot of hype for the UFC in 2024, both of this fight and build-up with Strickland and Adesanya, and it's getting to the point where Drakkar Klose, unironically, might be one of the best press conference fighters in the UFC, one of the best when it comes to press conferences, and no one expected that from Drakkar. And the next fighter I'm going to go with is Diego Lopez, the guy who just won at UFC 306. Diego Lopez is in a very similar position to Pereira, where he's fought on short notice and saved so many cards this year. Came into the UFC after fighting on UFC 295, like Aspel, like Pereira, KO'd Pat Sabatini, and then immediately, same for Pereira, came back at UFC 300 to get his first ranked fighter. Well, not his first ranked fighter, because he had fought, obviously, Evloev, but ends up facing Sadiq Youssef at UFC 300, which was a difficult matchup, and just went out there and brought the fight to Sadiq Youssef, made it entertaining, made it a scrap, and finished him in that first round. One of the best finishes on UFC 300, and we know how good of a card that was. And then Dan Ige ends up stepping in on short notice, extremely short notice, when he was supposed to be fighting Brian Ortega. He could have easily said, no, I don't want to fight Dan Ige, this is a brand new opponent, I wanted to fight Ortega, I'm going to wait until I get the Ortega rematch, or the rescheduling, and he fights Dan Ige. He doesn't say no, he fights on like a couple of hours notice, gets the win against Dan Ige. People kind of shit on his performance in this fight, but he still got the win against Dan Ige at the end of the day. And then he gets rescheduled against Brian Ortega, the guy who was originally meant to fight anyway, so we didn't really have to fight Dan Ige in the first place. And he goes out there and puts on an absolute banger of fight at UFC 306 against Brian Ortega. And he's already said he's happy to be the mate, or the backup, for the title fight with Elite Tapori and Max Holloway. And I think he's definitely deserved the title shot. Diego Lopez, in all of his fights so far in 2023, in all of his fights in his UFC career so far, not 2023, 2024, but in all of his UFC career so far, all of his fights have been entertaining. So I think Diego Lopez definitely deserves some recognition of a fighter who's kind of brought the entertainment to the UFC in 2024 consistently. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, the fighters who kind of ruined 2024, the fighters who definitely let the UFC kind of down in 2024. The first fighter that I've got is Conor McGregor. I think Conor McGregor massively let the UFC down and a lot of fans down this year, just for multiple reasons. The first main reason is obviously he had this big fight with Michael Chandler that was originally booked for UFC in June at UFC 303, which was already a really late scheduling anyway. We all wanted him to come back in like 2023, and he makes us wait until June 2024. So he took a while to get this fight announcement anyway, but the fight was booked, the hype was there, people were starting to get excited about his fight with Michael Chandler, and then he pulls out due to a toe injury after previously mocking other fighters of pulling out due to silly things as well. He pulls out due to a toe injury and completely ruins the card of UFC 303. Doesn't really tell the UFC about it until late as well, and it's got to the point where I don't even know if McGregor's going to be fighting again. I can only imagine it being a Conor McGregor fan in 2024. You must be so confused of if this guy's ever going to fight again. Even Michael Chandler's moved past him. Now he's going to be facing Charles Oliveira at UFC 309, so even he's now disinterested in Conor McGregor. So I don't know if Conor McGregor's ever going to be fighting again, and it's just the fact that he's been tweeting about everyone, talking as if he is going to make his big comeback this year, just for him to pull out and not give any more information. And it's just the false promises. He said he's going to be coming back in December of 2023, then he said he's going to be coming back in June 2024, then it was going to be late 2024. The dude just keeps postponing his own fight. So I feel like Conor McGregor's definitely brought nothing good to the UFC in 2024. And I'm also going to go with one that I think a lot of people will agree with in Jon Jones. Jon Jones has just been, again, we say Aspel saved the heavyweight division. Jon Jones ruined the heavyweight division. I don't think much people are kind of counting him as the actual undisputed heavyweight champion like they are with Tom Aspinall. He gets the heavyweight title fight against Cyril Gane, which, let's be honest, was a very favourable matchup to begin with. A guy that has zero grappling at UFC 285. Gets the win over Cyril Gane in the first round. That was a good win. Fair play to Jones. But that was all the way back in March of 2023. And we're now in November. Well, by the time he fights, it's going to be November of 2024. Which is nearly 2 years in the making, and he's just had the belt with absolutely no activity. He's not fighting any of the top 5 contenders in his big comeback. He's not fighting Aspinall, the winner of, well, I guess the winner of Gane versus Volkov don't really make sense considering he's already fought Gane. But the point I'm trying to make is it's not like he's coming back against a top contender, an up-and-coming contender. He's facing Stipe. No one wants to see the fight with Stipe, the guy that hasn't fought since all the way back in March of 2021 when he got flatlined by Francis Ngannou. That's the guy that Jon Jones is fighting on his comeback fight. He's already said he's going to retire after that, so it's not like we can really look forward to us after Stipe. And this is a fight that, listen, we're going to be tuning into it, but it's not like a fight where everyone's excited for. It's not a fight, a nail biter like a fight like Pereira or Holloway. So I think Jon Jones has definitely kind of ruined the UFC in 2024, ruined the heavyweight division. I wouldn't really mind it if he was to face Stipe Miocic and it wasn't for the heavyweight belt, because at least the heavyweight title picture would be clean. We've got guys like Jon Jones in the heavyweight picture, who's just, again, he's worse than McGregor in the sense that he's just held the belt and held up the division for 2 years straight, and his comeback fight is Stipe. He's definitely ruined the UFC. I'm going to go with Manel Kape. I feel like Manel Kape was once kind of a bit of a fan favourite in the flyweight division, but I feel like this year he's kind of just lost all of his hype. Obviously, he had that fight at UFC 293 after he beat Felipe dos Santos, and we were all hyped because he got the win. He went in and had that iconic post-fight Octagon interview, or Octagon speech, called out Kai France, and he had a lot of hype to his name. Then he gets matched up against Matheus Nicolau early this year, misses weight, which is one thing to miss weight. Against Matheus Nicolau, completely ruins the card, gets it cancelled, well, don't ruin the card, but ruins the fight, gets it cancelled by missing weight for the second time in his UFC career. Then he gets rescheduled against Matheus Nicolau and once again ruins it by pulling out due to an injury. So the fight with Matheus Nicolau twice was ruined by Manel Kape, and then he finally gets a different matchup, gets to fight Muhammad Mokaev on the main card of UFC 304, and the way that these guys were going at it, in the weigh-ins, the build-up, we were expecting this to be an absolute war, and I also critiqued Mokaev for this. Even like minutes before the fight in the Octagon, they were trying to go at it, and they put on arguably one of the, even though UFC 304 wasn't even a good card, they still managed to make it one of the most boring fights on the entire card. The way they were fighting, you wouldn't have thought they would have had this massive, this big anticipation before it, and then he ends up losing that fight with Muhammad Mokaev as well, just to put the nail in the stamp. So I feel like Manel Kape has definitely lost a lot of his hype, pulling out, missing weight, doesn't really seem disciplined, scrapping with Mokaev before the fight, and then just to go out there and put in a terrible performance, losing the fight, and I don't think he's got a fight booked anymore anyway. So I'm going to have to include Manel Kape in this list. I feel like he has kind of fucked up the UFC. If you're a Manel Kape fan in 2024, it must be difficult dealing with this guy. I'm also going to go with Aljamain Sterling. Now, I don't think he's as bad as the others on this list, but I'm just going to have to give an honourable mention to Aljamain Sterling. I do think he's kind of brought a lot of I just think he's kind of not really been wanted in the UFC in 2024. Obviously got knocked out against Sean O'Malley for the bantamweight belt back when obviously that was all the way back in August. Made a shit ton of excuses, started whining online, still talk shit to O'Malley to this day, the same guy that KO'd you. You know, now he's just hiding behind Merab to insult O'Malley while Merab does all the work. And then he finally gets a fight in a different division, gets matched up against Calvin Kattar on the biggest card of the year, UFC 300, and it was definitely the worst fight on the card. It was a boring fight, don't get me wrong. Dominant performance from Aljamain Sterling, it wasn't even close. But from an entertainment standpoint, on the biggest card of the UFC this year, or honestly in history, one of the biggest in history, it was the worst performance. Gets the win, gets the decision win against Calvin Kattar. Then he gets to fight with Movsar Evloev after talking so much crap to Evloev back and forth on Twitter. Finally gets the matchup against Movsar Evloev to see how he does against a grappler, and now he's even pulled out of that. He's pulled out of that fight, expects Evloev to be fighting Sterling, expects Evloev to just wait it out and face Sterling after. So I feel like Aljamain Sterling kind of deserves an honourable mention on this list. But those are the fighters, in my opinion, who have saved and ruined the UFC so far in 2024. Obviously, we've still got a few months to go, but so far, those are the fighters that have to make the list. Let me know your thoughts on this list. Thank you for watching.